Let me introduce you to plus family members. Let me introduce you to my son. Let me introduce you to my dad. Let me introduce you to my mom. Let me introduce you to my aunt. Let me introduce you to my wife. Let me introduce you to my uncle. Let me introduce you to my niece. Let me introduce you to my sister. Let me introduce you to my cousin. Let me introduce you to my nephew. Let me introduce you to my godson. Let me introduce you to my ex-wife. Let me introduce you to my stepmom. Let me introduce you to my stepdad. Let me introduce you to my brother. Let me introduce you to my in-laws. Let me introduce you to my husband. Let me introduce you to my grandma. Let me introduce you to my stepson. Let me introduce you to my grandpa. Let me introduce you to my ex-niece. Let me introduce you to my daughter. Let me introduce you to my godmother. Let me introduce you to my godfather. Let me introduce you to my ex-nephew. Let me introduce you to my ex-husband. Let me introduce you to my foster son. Let me introduce you to my great-aunt. Let me introduce you to my ex-stepmom. Let me introduce you to my half-niece. Let me introduce you to my son-in-law. Let me introduce you to my ex-stepdad. Let me introduce you to my step-niece. Let me introduce you to my ex-stepson. Let me introduce you to my half-nephew. Let me introduce you to my step-nephew. Let me introduce you to my goddaughter. Let me introduce you to my twin sister. Let me introduce you to my half-sister. Let me introduce you to my half-sister. Let me introduce you to my great-uncle. Let me introduce you to my step-grandma. Let me introduce you to my third cousin. Let me introduce you to my niece-in-law. Let me introduce you to my step-grandpa. Let me introduce you to my twin brother. Let me introduce you to my twin brother. Let me introduce you to my stepdaughter. Let me introduce you to my half-brother. Let me introduce you to my father-in-law. Let me introduce you to my ex-son-in-law. Let me introduce you to my foster sister. Let me introduce you to my mother-in-law. Let me introduce you to my sister-in-law. Let me introduce you to my mother-in-law. Let me introduce you to my sister-in-law. Let me introduce you to my great-grandpa. Let me introduce you to my second cousin. Let me introduce you to my great-grandma. Let me introduce you to my nephew-in-law. Let me introduce you to my great-stepdad. Let me introduce you to my step-grandson. Let me introduce you to my great-stepdad. Let me introduce you to my step-grandson. Let me introduce you to my adopted sister. Let me introduce you to my brother-in-law. Let me introduce you to my foster brother. Let me introduce you to my adopted brother. Let me introduce you to my daughter-in-law. Let me introduce you to my foster daughter. Let me introduce you to my foster daughter. Let me introduce you to my ex-step-grandpa. Let me introduce you to my ex-sister-in-law. Let me introduce you to my ex-father-in-law. Let me introduce you to my ex-great-grandpa. Let me introduce you to my ex-great-grandma. Let me introduce you to my ex-mother-in-law. Let me introduce you to my ex-mother-in-law. Let me introduce you to my ex-brother-in-law. Let me introduce you to my ex-daughter-in-law. Let me introduce you to my former stepdaughter. Let me introduce you to my ex-step-granddaughter.